Well, thank you everybody for coming here today. Well, I guess you are going to meet together, but thank you for coming to one of the Anoka County Library branches. So I have known Rebecca for quite a while now. Before working at the library, we both had our time working at the Minnesota Historical Society. And so as we're doing this different kind of outreach work, we're kind of running into each other again, which is really, really cool. And I grew up here in Anoka County. So not only is it really fun and great for me to come and work as an associate librarian in my home county, but then also to bring this type of history kind of back here for the people that I've been close to my whole life. So thank you all for coming to this meeting. Rebecca, I'll let you go.
Thank you. And after the Minnesota Historical Society, we worked together at Mapping Prejudice.
Yeah.
Yes,
I was
where
an intern.
Carissa was a research assistant. And so we've had this serendipitous passing. So thank you all so much for having me here tonight. My name is Rebecca Gillette, and I am one of the Associate Directors and Community Engagement Lead at Mapping Prejudice. So here we're going to start by doing 2 slides. I guess I'll have to do, there we go. So before I begin my presentation, I want to recognize that we're situated on Minnesota Makoche. Minnesota Makoche in the Dakota language means the land where the waters reflect the sky and is the traditional homeland of the Dakota people. I always kind of direct you, me as a community to really start to continue to learn more about the history of Minnesota's Dakota and Ojibwe people and seek out ways in which we as a community can help repair the harms committed over time. I also want to acknowledge that much of what we know of this history today, including its culture, economic growth, and the development throughout history and time, has been made possible by the labor of enslaved African Americans and their descendants who suffered the horror of the transatlantic trafficking of their people, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow, and we're indebted to their labor and sacrifice. So, illustrating this line between the present and past inequities is really critical to our work at Mapping Prejudice. Today, I'll be talking about housing equity in the 20th century. So why do I begin by sharing that map by Marlena Miles? Because maps reveal so much. And at the core of my presentation, this is the history of land being reserved for white people. The history of land dispossession for American Indians is deeply tied to historical moments related to treaty rights, the U.S. Dakota War of 1862 and subsequent Homestead Act, the Indian Reorganization Act, and establishment of Indian housing programs, and so on, all of which deserve its own presentation, time, space, and expertise. I do recommend, if anybody wants to dig a little bit deeper, a great book entitled American Indians and the American Dream, Policies, Place, and Property in Minnesota by Casey Keeler, if you want to explore that further. I will say, however, that racial covenants, which I'll share about in a minute, are a form of the same forced historical displacement of Indigenous and African American communities, and they still carry significant effects today. So I'm going to start by centering us today. You can see here. In the Twin Cities and surrounding area, we routinely show up in national magazines or on top 10 bests for best parks, best trails, the most livable place to live, and on and on. But it's often lost on Minnesota writers or Minnesota promoters to add the clause at the end of each of these, for whom, and in particular, for whom is it most livable? If we claim to be such prosperous city and surrounding areas, based on all of these qualities, everyone should benefit and prosper, right? Yet, when we look at the Twin Cities metro home ownership rates, there are huge disparities. 75% of white families own their own home, while only 33% of Black families can make the same claim. The Twin Cities has among the highest gaps between black and white homeownership rates in the nation. The work we do at Mapping Prejudice is examining the roots of this history to make sense of these contemporary statistics. Our current disparities are rooted in a critical turning point at the beginning of the 20th century, and that was the decision to use private contracts to reserve huge swaths of land for the exclusive use of white people. These private contracts were called racial covenants, which are clauses that were inserted into home property deeds, such as this example you're seeing, to keep people who were not white from buying or occupying certain pieces of land. For most of the 20th century, they were composed and promoted by a huge cast of characters: realtors, city planners, bankers, and elected officials. Racial covenants worked in concert with other practices like white violence, real estate steering, and redlining to bar non-white people from owning land and homes on the land. I'm about to read some examples, and I think it's important to state that the language that you will see and hear is racist and painful. And if you need to take care of yourself or step out, I completely understand. So the earliest racial covenant that we found in Minnesota was put in place in South Minneapolis in 1910. That's when Henry and Lenora Scott sold a property at 35th Avenue South to Nels Anderson, a Swedish baker. The home was extremely modest, but the deed for this property included this racial restriction, which is pictured here, that stipulated, quote, "The party of the second part hereby agrees that the premises hereby conveyed shall not be at any time conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. Said restrictions shall run with the land." You may not be familiar with who he was in history, but if some of you might be familiar with a parallel street along the West River Road in Minneapolis, Edmund Boulevard, which was named after him. Walton inserted this language into thousands of other deeds in Hennepin and Ramsey counties. Across Minnesota, hundreds of landowners, developers, and city officials followed Walton's lead. They composed dozens of variations on the language that he first put to text. So I want to show you some additional examples of racial covenants. Again, I read them aloud not to inflict pain on people, but rather to bear witness to this practice and history. No person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall be permitted to occupy said premises. The property here from Coon Rapids included this racial restriction that stated, "This property shall not be sold, transferred, conveyed, rented, or occupied by Negroes or person of the Negro descent." And here's another example located in Blaine of the type of language used. "And no person or persons other than the Caucasian race shall be permitted to occupy said premises of any part thereof." And here in Minneapolis, you can see the language appear in an open advertisement for the sale of land in Minneapolis. Fourth, that grantee cannot sell or lease said real estate to a colored person. You have my assurance that the above restrictions shall be enforced to the fullest extent of the law. And here, the same advertisement, written in Swedish and directed towards new Swedish immigrants. In English or in Swedish, you can see that this is no secret. Covenants are advertised as an amenity, and they send a message as to who gets to participate in whiteness. Looking at and reading the language of these covenants aloud is a first step if we want to move forward together. We need to confront this racism and acknowledge that it had its intended impact. I always say to any audience I speak to, for those who have firsthand experience with the consequences of this text, I hope that this public presentation will affirm your lived experience and empower you to going forward with the facts. And for any of the rest of us, we can now respond to denials that this history didn't take place by simply responding, "Don't believe me. Look at these primary source documents." The Fair Housing Act of 1968 made racial covenants illegal. And once this happened, there was a rush to forget, at least among white people. Our team is working on peeling back this intentional amnesia and empowering communities to engage in collective remembering. We're trying to create data to help communities of color and white abolitionists demand change. One important thing to note and acknowledge about covenants is that they were not a secret when they were in use, but rather a selling point. So I laid the basic foundation of what racial covenants are and where they were located in property deeds. I'd like to come back to today and talk a little bit about our work and our mission. Mapping Prejudice started in 2016, really as an experiment, merging public history and technology as a transformative narrative about our history of structural racism. Our team resolved to do something no one had ever done before, and that was to build the first ever comprehensive map of racial covenants for an American city. We wanted to know things like, how many were there? What did they actually say? Where were they used? How much land did they cover? And we decided to answer these questions in an unconventional way. We took digitized property records from Hennepin County and used computers to flag digitized documents that seemed to have racist language embedded in them. And then we harnessed the power of community. We put the digitized property records we flagged into a crowdsourcing online platform called Zooniverse. This platform allowed us to invite community members from all backgrounds into this work. To date, over 12,000 volunteers have identified and mapped over 70,000 property records that contain a racial covenant. And when we put this information on a map, this is what we got. So this is our contagion map. And I always say contagion meaning the spreading of harmful ideas or practices. So if you look at this contagion map, you can see the spread of racial covenants over time. From a very high level, you can see how intentionally adding racial covenants to these properties created exclusive spaces for white people. The patterns that were laid down by the covenants persist today and really define where the best resourced areas are, all defined by where one lives. Where we each live correlates with living wage job markets, equitable education opportunities, access to green space, and even over criminalization of communities of color. And these maps that you can see here run through 1963, so I'll let this run until the end here. So as it's finishing, mapping is complete for Anoka County, and we've identified roughly 1,800 properties between 1911 and 1967 that contain a racial covenant. And I'm going to show you some of these maps. The number of property records we're finding with racial covenants continues to grow. So here you can see at a very high level view of Anoka County. And here, as I go through slowly, you can see specific areas within Anoka County. So this is the central region. This is the northeast region of Anoka County, the city of Anoka, Lexington and Lionel Lakes area, and then the southern area. Today, community volunteers are reading property deeds from Washington, D.C., Forsyth County, which surrounds Winston-Salem in North Carolina, and Contra Costa County that surrounds San Francisco in California. So I want everyone to understand one more, Columbia Heights, down below there. I want everybody to understand how powerful covenants were. Once a covenant was embedded into a property deed, they ran with the land. And it didn't matter how many times the property changed hands or what was built on the land. Anyone who, whoops, I need to move this, excuse me. This is where the technical. Okay. So once, as I mentioned, the covenants ran with the land. So it didn't matter how many times the land changed hands or what was built on it. Anyone who broke a covenant, even after the property had changed hands multiple times, ended up risked going back to court and losing all the equity in the property that they had purchased. A breach triggered a process that put the land back in the hands of the person who put the covenant in the first place. And if that person had passed away, it would go to their heirs. So people often ask if there was resistance by white people to these covenants. This is significant in acknowledging this history. Covenants had overwhelming support among white people. Opinion surveys in the 1940s showed that most white people in Minnesota believed covenants were beneficial. They believed that racial restrictions protected property values and neighborhood harmony. There's an idea that American cities have always been segregated, and the farther back in time you go, the more segregated things were. But that's not true. Black people were able to initially settle in many parts of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and then they were then forced into smaller and smaller areas, beginning in the 1920s. And I'll go through time for both of you. You can see in the green starts to appear, that's the racial covenants. Neighborhoods with covenants are still the whitest in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and surrounding areas. The patterns established by 1940 through covenants persist today. As covenants were developing, there were just as many instances of racist white violence over black-owned property, as reported in the Minneapolis newspapers. You can see these examples during the 4-year span of 1908 through 1912. Black people, by contrast, saw covenants as a threat to fundamental liberty. In Minnesota, Black people leaders such as Nellie Francis, who in 1921 led efforts to enact the state anti-lynching statute. Lena Olive Smith, who was the first African-American woman licensed to practice law in Minnesota, and in 1921, and Katie McQuat, who served for 17 years with the St. Paul NAACP and Urban League, and who in 1964 was the first Black candidate to run and win a St. Paul City Council seat. All of these Black women devoted their lives to fighting these practices. These leaders are examples of resistance through the channels where they had the most agency. There were other stories of Black resistance by courageous individuals. This is what Arthur and Edith Lee did in 1931 when they bought a small bungalow at 4600 Columbus Avenue South in South Minneapolis with a contract for deed. This is a 1964 example of a contract for deed, but it still had the same language. For those who don't know what a contract for deed is, it's when the buyer, in the case the Lee family, makes payments to their owner until the entire house is paid off and it legally becomes theirs. Sometimes it's referred to as rent to own. Buyers had all the responsibilities of a homeowner, But at any time, if a missed payment happened, they could lose the house, the original seller could keep the profits, and then create the same arrangement with a new buyer. It was yet another predatory lending practice that impacted Black families all over the country. So what this meant was the Lee family was in a very vulnerable position. For the Lees, they had an unrecorded contract for deed, which is the quieter route for sellers to profit. So they took a risk to live in a comfortable neighborhood for their family. When the neighbors found out that the Lees, a Black family, was moving in, they organized a stop for sale. They called the realtor, the bank, the city council, and other neighbors. When the Lees ignored the neighborhood threats and moved into their home, they found themselves under attack. Thousands of people gathered around the house. They tried to burn it down. They threatened to murder the Lee family. They shot out the windows and threw black paint on the siding, which you can see in the left-hand photo, where Edith is standing with her kindergarten-age daughter, Mary. The Lees held on for 2 years, after which time they finally succumbed to the pressure and moved. Before the Lees moved in to their neighborhood, there were federal actions that set the stage for the neighborhood violence that they faced. Typically, when purchasing a house in the early 20th century, buyers had to pay for the house within 5 years. So when the Federal Housing Administration was created by Congress in 1934, in essence, it changed this tight timeline in which buyers had to pay in full for their house. The administration created the modern mortgage system in which buyers could pay equal fixed payments over a 15 to 30-year period. This new structure made it much more accessible to home buyers. However, this change in practice was not open to Black families. This was because the Federal Housing Administration incorporated racist ideas in their manual, such as opposing the, quote, mixing of races, which to them meant the decline in property values. And you can see it here in this coded language, the surest protection against undesirable encroachment and inharmonious use. In the late 30s, the federal government paid local housing appraisers nationwide to create city maps that graded neighborhoods on their risk for lenders. These maps are one example of what we now call the redlining maps. There were many factors considered in the grading system, and race was one of them. These maps visually illustrated that racially mixed neighborhoods were not good investments for lenders. Some neighborhoods were described in red as high risk or quote unquote hazardous, hence the name redlining. Redlining maps point to places where getting investment from banks or government agencies was difficult. I've talked about legacies of covenants, white violence, federal agencies created, and informal laws that strengthened segregation. The creation of the freeways was really a straightforward way in defining spaces. Every American city has a historically Black neighborhood that was, quote, demolished, slashed in two, or cut off from the rest of the city by a highway. This was not an accident. This map helps us see that the freeway system was designed to do more than move cars. It was really a social engineering project. The urban interstate highway system was constructed to drive what planners called urban renewal. Urban renewal was more than the demolition of old buildings. As James Baldwin would later declare very directly in a 1963 Boston Public Television interview, that urban renewal was actually quote unquote Negro removal. Minneapolis and St. Paul were no exception. These vibrant, close, tight-knit communities. All of the systems and the systemic decisions and intentional acts show enduring demographic patterns. I again come back to think about all of the things that we each have access to or don't have access to in our own neighborhoods. Schools, health, access to green space, food deserts or food sources, and even tree canopy. With all the overlays that I'm showing, you start to see that access to resources and opportunities is fundamentally based on where one lives. The broad outlines of these stories are the same, but the destruction unfolded in different ways in each of these places. I show this map just to show Anoka County again. It's an older map, but I also wanted to just say, because of time constraints, I won't cover things like the GI Bill and neighborhood steering, yet another way that was impacted housing equity across the country. I think what's most important, though, is to think about all these formal and informal practices that I'm highlighting as layers versus silos. Sometimes they're very clear-cut with a direct chronology, and sometimes they're muddled together. Our work at Mapping Prejudice focuses not only on identifying and mapping racial covenants, but also unearthing public history narratives that illuminate racist tools in the system toolbox to keep Black families from homeownership, access to resources, and the ability to pass down generational wealth. Narratives that also illuminate the agency and self-determination of Black communities despite external pressures. So I've shared a lot of history and how these systems have interacted over time. I think it's really helpful to humanize all of this to help illustrate the impact on Black and white families with different embedded but understood rules. So now I'd like to share a little bit about my family. In 1963, my mom and dad, Scotty and Peter Gillette, purchased this house in the Kenwood neighborhood of South Minneapolis. They paid $22,000 with a low-interest loan of 4.5%. They also helped with a gift of $2,000 from my grandpa as a down payment for the house. They had 3 girls, including me, and while it was an incredible financial stretch to live there for our family, I recognize the privilege of living in Kenwood. And I'll just show you on the covenant map where our house was located. So each time a house was sold, my parents could accumulate wealth that they could reinvest in their future and that of my 2 sisters and me. And ultimately, their investments were used to help each of us when we were older and ready to buy our own homes. The gift from my grandpa to buy our house was not unusual. In fact, down payment assistance is not exceptional. 30% of white people get family help to purchase their family. I've talked about several well-known Black leaders who resisted these racist systems that were intended to create racialized spaces. There are so many more untold stories of Black resistance by courageous individuals that still need to be unearthed in our history. But I'm going to tell you about 2 other people, my in-laws. This is Elsie and Willie Joe Sellers, my mother and father-in-law. And I would argue that they were one of the courageous resistors, simply by claiming space. They came to Minnesota from Arkansas and Tennessee as part of the Great Migration, seeking opportunity and homeownership for their families in the North. In 1965, after renting off of Lake Street with their 3 young children, including my husband Daryl, Elsie and Willie Joe purchased this house at 4736 Oakland Avenue on the edge of the Old South Side, the historically Black neighborhood in South Minneapolis. They bought the house on an unrecorded contract for deed for $7,500 with an 18-year term. And here you can see where I grew up in relationship to where my husband Daryl grew up. So I want to put the Sellers neighborhood, my in-laws' neighborhood, in context. Up the block from the Sellers, at 4853 Oakland, lived Belvin and Betty Norris, who bought their house a few years before my in-laws. Their daughter was Michelle Norris, who would become a nationally celebrated journalist. You might be familiar with her current work on the Race Card Project, or I always say if you're old like me, you might remember her from NPR's All Things Considered. Michelle was born just a few months after Belvin and Betty moved in. Michelle writes in her memoir, quote, "We weren't trying to be activists," my mother said. "We just decided it was time to live someplace nice. We worked hard with white people at the post office who could live wherever they wanted, and we wanted to do the same." So Daryl and Michelle grew up a block apart in a neighborhood that Daryl describes just as I did where I grew up, with strong and positive memories where they went to the same school, interacted at 38th Street Food Market. Neighbors would attend Sabathani Missionary Baptist Church. All of these locations were the connective tissue within the old South Side neighborhood. They were social, religious, and educational spaces formed despite the external pressures and attempting to create racialized islands in Minneapolis. Because from within the old South Side came mutual aid, political organizing, art, culture, joy, agency, and education, an incredibly strong relational community. So Elsie and Willie Joe's house at the old South Side, I'm pointing out here on the map, they were also not trying to be activists 1 block away from where Michelle Norris grew up. They simply wanted a home for their family. And I put this in context, if you remember, just a few blocks in the other direction, on 46th and Columbus, you can see where the Lee family house is, where I shared their story from a little bit earlier. Notice what maps can tell us. The 3 identified houses do not have covenants on them. But by paying attention, you can see the freeway as a barrier on the left side, and the covenants that surround the neighborhood as another barrier. We often refer to this as the halo effect. There's no need to put covenants in the middle because they're surrounded by them. My mother and father-in-law, Elsie and Willie Joe, made good on those rent-to-own payments, and for financial needs throughout the years, had other mortgage arrangements. At one time in 1987, they took out a 5-year mortgage for roughly $8,000 at an astonishing interest rate of almost 22%. For comparison, an average mortgage rate today might be around 7%. They hung on to the house until 2013, when they had to foreclose because of medical expenses. So after 47 years of my in-laws living in this house, my husband Daryl and his 2 sisters walked away with a mere $5,000. Our 2 family narratives illustrate the history of racialized housing and the contemporary impact of homeownership gap between Black and white families. This is a picture of my family. We're the children of Scotty and Peter Gillette and Elsie and Willie Joe Sellers. Our family's stories tell on a human level how the system, but really 2 systems, impacted our parents. My mom and dad, who as white people had access to all the resources, were supported by laws and policies, and had no idea that their world and mine was nothing other than normal. Versus my in-laws, Elsie and Willie Joe, who understood the racist housing playbook they had to work within, yet resisted until the end. Our parents' experiences also had a direct impact on what was and wasn't passed on to me and my husband, which impacts then what we as parents can or cannot pass on to our 2 children when they're ready to purchase a house. Generational wealth that could have potentially supported their futures more impactfully. Thanks to Black activism and resistance, racial covenants have been illegal everywhere in the country since 1968. That's when Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, which made racial covenants illegal. But the impact is still the same. A year after the Fair Housing Act was passed, Dr. Martin Luther King published a book in which he prophetically stated, quote, "Many of the ugly pages of American history have been obscured and forgotten. A society is always eager to cover misdeeds with a cloak of forgetfulness. But no society can fully repress an ugly past when the ravages persist into the present." I would say this is why I do my job and why Mapping Prejudice does this work, and why presenting this shared history is so important. First and foremost, not to forget the impact or to learn about the impact of racial covenants today. The history of racial covenants was not about personal choice. It was a system. And I come from those who benefited over time, so it's important for me and our team to help people see and acknowledge who benefited and who was harmed. And then the question is, how do we mitigate the harm? So now that we collectively know this history and understand its effects over time, I ask, what can I do? What can you do? What can we do together collectively? What tools or skills do you have, and how can you put them to work? So here are just a few ideas. You can tell friends and family what you've learned tonight. You can be honest about your institution's role in which you work on the historically racist practice, and I will start with my own. I come out of the University of Minnesota Libraries. We actually, on our website, have a section called Stories from the Map, and about 3 months ago, we published a story map entitled The House You Built, Stories of Race and Racism in the Built Environment at the University of Minnesota. So it's hard as a team, we value telling this history. It's really important if we're gonna do this, that we also need to acknowledge the history of the institution from which we work. I always say listen and take guidance from people living with the consequences of these policies, work to change policies and structures, and support conversations about reparative work. So thank you so much for inviting me today. I'll do one final slide, I think, for everybody, which is we'll save time for questions in person, but also if anybody's interested in getting involved with Mapping Prejudice, you can scan that QR code, which will lead you to our website. And for those that are in person, I've actually brought some handouts that you're welcome to take afterwards. So thank you so much, and thank you for your patience managing 2 different systems.
Thank you.